chance to move down a little bit. Let's see. Well, welcome to the forum. Tonight, the topic is Embedded or in Bed, Press Coverage of the Iraq War. And this forum is jointly sponsored by the Institute of Politics and the Shorenstein Center on Press Politics and Public Policy. I'm Tom Patterson. I'm the Bradley Professor here at the Kennedy School. I'm filling in for Alex Jones, who unavoidably is unable to be here this evening. And we have 6 distinguished panelists who are going to talk about embedded journalism in the context of the Iraq War. To my immediate left is Ann Barnard, a Boston Globe reporter who covered the Afghanistan War from Pakistan and then the Iraq War from Central Command in Qatar. With the fall of Baghdad, she went into Iraq as a non-embedded reporter. To her left is Alex Kazar, who's the Matthew W. Sterling Professor of History and Social Policy at the Kennedy School. Among his books is The Right to Vote, which received the American Historical Association's annual award for Best Book on U.S. History. Brian McQuarrie, like Ann Barnard, is a Boston Globe reporter and a veteran of both the Afghanistan and Iraq conflicts. Unlike Ann, he was an embedded reporter, traveling with the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, the lead Army division in the march to Baghdad. To his left, next to Brian, is Tad Olstrom, a veteran of 35 years in the U.S. Air Force. General Olstrom directs the National Security Program here at the Kennedy School. As a fighter pilot, he participated in combat in both Southeast and Southwest Asia, twice earning, among other decorations, the Distinguished Flying Cross. Todd Purdom, on his left, is an award-winning correspondent in the New York Times Washington Bureau, where luckily he covers a range of topics from politics to culture. Previously, he was the Times White House correspondent. And on the far left is Bob Woodruff, who's an ABC correspondent and the anchor of ABC's Saturday evening newscast. He covered the Afghanistan war from Pakistan and then from within Afghanistan. During the Iraq War, he was an embedded journalist with the 1st Marine Division, which led the eastern push toward Baghdad. Rather than having each of the panelists talk in turn, we're going to have a discussion about embedded journalism. We'll get through 1 round for sure, hopefully 2, and then we'll take it to the audience. Before starting that discussion, I'd like to give you a little bit of an understanding of how embedded journalism came about. The explanation starts with Vietnam. Dan Hallen and others have described Vietnam as the uncensored war. There was almost no limit on journalists in Vietnam. Wherever they could hitch a ride, they could go. There was no censor that was looking at their reports, so there was nothing between them and the filing of a report rather than their own energy. I was in Vietnam as a Special Forces officer in a quite remote location. I think in the 8 months or so that I was in the field, we had 30 or 40 journalists who came in. We told them pretty much anything they wanted to know. Our biggest challenge was sometimes keeping them out of the field and trying to get them to stay overnight so we could take a little money off them in our poker games. And it was a system that really worked well. The relationship between the journalist and the soldier was a pretty easy one until the Vietnam War started to go sour. And as it did, the images on television changed, increasingly images of street protests, body bags. Many in journalism credit themselves with preventing the United States from a worse debacle than Vietnam was. Many in the armed forces, however, believed that the media contributed to the defeat by eroding the public confidence that was necessary to maintain the war effort. And I think it was from that perspective that the military, and of course the civilian authorities that oversee the military, shut the press out completely in the beginning phase of the invasions of Grenada and Panama in the 1980s. The government obviously had an interest in building public support for the Gulf War in the early 1990s, and so journalists were invited to come. But they were pretty tightly constrained. The reports were censored, and they worked in pools. They were not permitted to go to the front lines. No journalists died in combat in the Gulf War. 60 were killed in Vietnam. But reporters were very angry about that arrangement, that they had been denied access to the front lines. And at sessions at places like the Shorenstein Center, the Columbia Journalism School, kind of almost any forum that reporters could talk about this, they discussed and said, we're not going to do that again. That's not going to happen. Parts of the military were also unhappy with the arrangement. Because journalists were not allowed on the front lines, the public by and large saw only the air war. You'll recall the precision bombing and the Scuds and the Patriots. Pictures essentially provided to the press by the military. The U.S. Army, on the other hand, fought the biggest tank battle since Second World War, and there was almost no coverage of it. And so reporting also became an issue at places like the Army War College. And out of this came this idea of embedded journalism, which seemed at once to serve both the interests of reporters and the military, the reporters' desire for access, and the military's interest in a certain type of war coverage. Although not uncensored, there was censorship that accompanied embedded journalism. So tonight we're going to try to ask and answer the question of how well this experiment, embedded journalism, worked and whose interests were served by the system. Brian McQuarrie, let's start with you. You were embedded with the 3rd Infantry Division. What do you see as the advantages and disadvantages of embedded journalism?
Well, when I began, I was extremely concerned about if I could remain objective. I thought that I would become too close to the troops, that this might compromise my reporting. But I found out within the first few days of the war that the Globe wanted me to write about the troops that I was with. They did not want me to write about the war as a whole. And from that perspective, I thought the job that I was able to do to put a human face on the war worked very well. The Pentagon told us before the war that we'd have great access. They said that we could not write about the plans, we could not write about where we were. The rest of the war was fair game, and I thought that would dissolve in day one. But to their credit, it did not. And in that regard, I think that it was a success. The disadvantage that I saw was that I could not get it out of my group, the battalion that I was with. I could not talk to Iraqis on the way to Baghdad to find out what they thought about this. So I had blinders on in that regard, but I don't know how to get around that in a war.
Bob Woodruff, you were embedded with the 1st Marine Division. Do you have a similar view?
Similar. I think that embedding, first of all, it's a very unfortunate name, embedding, because it makes for really bad puns like embedded or in bed, like the name of this forum. But I think, first of all, the way I look at embedding in this particular war was the first position in a negotiation that's been ongoing with the military for quite some time. As you mentioned, when you look at the experience that we had in this war, I think you have to compare it to the Gulf War, where the pooling situation was absolutely untenable. I think it was a complete and utter failure. And in that sense, this particular setup was a great improvement. What we had in this situation was about 650, although I guess the numbers are a little higher now, maybe 700 plus reporters that were embedded with a military that most of us knew very little about. So now we've got a relatively educated reporter pool that can go back and report on the military in future conflicts and ongoing conflicts, and certainly in the war in Iraq as it continues now. In this very short invasion period where all these huge numbers of embedded reporters were involved, I think that people did a fairly decent job of reporting honestly about what we were able to see. I think on a macro level, though, it was very difficult to take all of that information and make it coherent and make it understandable to the American people. There was so much information coming out, and certainly there was a huge imbalance of information coming from the American side. This is no secret, because there were so few people embedded on the other side. There were no embeds in the Republican Guard, and none of us really had any interest in that. And there were far too few people reporting from Baghdad, and certainly the rest of the country, as all of us who have reported from Iraq know, you couldn't really go anywhere else other than Baghdad for the most part. And certainly at that period, as you know, right before the bombing started, a lot of reporters left because they were afraid. Consequently, you had a very one-sided report on this war.
And Barnard, you were at Central Command in Qatar and therefore dependent on official briefings. What was your sense of that process? I mean, some journalists have described it as similar to the 5 o'clock follies in Saigon. I don't know whether that matches your feelings or not.
Well, I think that ideally we had hoped that there would be sort of a balance between the embeds who would be able to get that ant's eye view on the ground that Brian was talking about, and they portrayed the CENTCOM press operation as if it was going to be a source of information that would help us to synthesize those reports from the field, and we would have access to experts, and we would have access to analysis maybe on background from senior officials. That really didn't happen very much, and it was very disappointing, and I think both from the military point of view and from the press point of view, a huge opportunity was lost to fully take advantage of what information was coming in from the embedded reporters. I also had the sense that there was a lot of tension between the military and civilian leaders of the press operation there, where the civilians who came from the political world were trying to make sure that the information fit the message that the Bush administration was trying to get out to the American public, whereas there was an urgent need really to put out information that would contextualize events on the battlefield. And a lot of that information, even if it was in some ways neutral, was not made available if it didn't fit a particular message that they were trying to get out that day.
Todd Purdom, you were in Washington during the combat phase of the Iraq War. What was the perspective there? What are your feelings now or then about embedded reporting?
Well, they're a little bit different now than they were then, in part because I've spent the past 5 months writing a book on behalf of the Times about the war and the run-up to it and the aftermath of it, using our own embedded coverage, our coverage from Washington, our coverage from CENTCOM, and the work of embedded reporters from a whole range of news organizations. And what you see when you look at all that in perspective is that, as Bob said, trying to understand this at the time was like drinking water from a fire hose. There was too much information and too little context and too little big picture. The news reports of the time often emphasized the wrong things. They emphasized the bad because that's our business. We emphasize the aberrant, the extraordinary. What we sometimes lost sight of was the unbelievable swiftness and really sort of unstoppable nature of the American advance toward Baghdad. And yes, it was a very dangerous kind of approach. It was a light invasion force. There were long supply lines. That's all true. But when you look back at the testimony of the troops and the commanders and the senior commanders, they never really felt they were stopped. There were debates about whether they should have waited for resupply and resecuring, and the weather helped them avoid that question by stopping them in their tracks. But while they were stopped on the ground, the air war continued. So it's just interesting to see the perspective. And when you put all the embedded reporting together, it makes an unbelievable mosaic, and I think it will turn out to be a fantastic service to history and to historians, because whatever the misemphasis might have been at the time and whatever broadcast or print reporting might have done to skew the impression at the time, there is now a historical record, incontrovertible, from firsthand witnesses of flattering and unflattering painful and proud moments of that campaign, and I can't imagine that it won't be fodder for historians for generations to come.
General Ostrom, you're slightly outnumbered here, and it's probably unfair to have you speak for the entire military, but how do you read embedded reporting from the military perspective?
If you're going to ask me to get on the other side of the fence of all these folks, I won't do that. But if you would have asked me, my first experience was back in the Vietnam War, where they asked me one day after I was very, very tired, the last thing I wanted to do is go up for another sortie with a reporter in the back seat of my F-4. And that experience just soured me in a huge way. I mean, it was, obviously the friction was there before we ever met, the friction was there during the flight, the friction was there after the flight. I'd say, this is no way to do business. If you had asked me after the end of the Gulf War, where we literally had a scheme, which Ann alluded to, where we herded all the reporters had to go into the corral, and that's the only place that the reporters could interact with the military at CENTCOM headquarters. And I was convinced after that that was no way to do that business either, and we spent most of the time since the Gulf War figuring out how to do this interface. I mean, we'd do it in our big exercises. But then when we got to this one, and when we had Tori Clark up here December almost a year ago, and Tori had a session over in the Shorenstein Center that we had a number of the fellows in, and laid out, if you would, the plan for embedding reporters into the operation, most of us were pretty excited. And when you take a look at what's happened since the 7 or 8 months since major conflict has ceased and Baghdad fell, think how many stories that you see that are negative about embedded reporters, and they're almost non-existent, which in my mind is a powerful statement that it basically worked. But we've also seen that there still is a little conflict because we still have the corral at CENTCOM headquarters that's not working exactly like it ought to work, and we still have this worry about being embedded or in bed, and that will come out, I think, over time. Most important, I think, is maybe the comment that just preceded mine, and that is history has got such a wealth of knowledge now that we never had in modern times about what went on in the war. We have to figure out how to pull it together. That's your job.
Alex Kazar, let me take off from that and see if you can fast forward a number of years and ask the question how history might end up looking at the embedded experiment.
I should say first, I feel a little bit like an imposter since I'm not a journalist or wasn't involved in this war. Although I do want to say, on my behalf, my credentials, that I did do some work as a journalist when I was in my 20s, long enough to once get shot at in the field, as a result of which I decided to become a historian, since my historical sources rarely shoot. I think, you know, as I try to imagine fast forwarding and looking back, I guess I would venture a couple of more critical comments, not so much about embeddedness per se or the quality of reporting that was coming from embedded reporters, but from the fact that the emphasis in the American news coverage became so overwhelmingly on what the embedded reporters were reporting. I mean, this goes back to what Bob said, that there was nobody embedded on the other side. I think one consequence of that for American public opinion was that it dehumanized the war. I remember watching on television, we all saw the same footage. There was that one camera that was mounted for a while, and every once in a while you would see one person sort of driving in a truck down the road, and then you'd see some bombing going on across the river. And I remember, after 3 days, I was like, does anybody live in Iraq? I mean, this was Baghdad, and it looked to be empty. And I think that was, that had an effect on the way in which we were all perceiving the war. And I think, and then in the larger context, again, fast forwarding to 20 years from now, 30 years from now, historians looking back, they will have this rich source of history of what was going on in the military, or at least one side of a military conflict. But it may well be that historians are going to look back at this as a war that was misguided at best and perhaps worse than that, and wonder why so much attention was being fixated on these details rather than on larger questions of politics and policy, which did not receive much attention.
This is a question either for Brian or Bob. Anyone else who'd like to join in can too. Was censorship an issue? I mean, there was a formal censorship process. Did it ever arise?
Well, I mean, it was kind of a natural censorship. I mean, the number one rule was, look, you are going to be with this military group for a long period of time. Chances are you are not going to report your position at the time, where you're going to go next, and any type of force protection issue, any issue that may endanger your unit. I think some of the worry in previous conflicts was that reporters would come into a unit for a very brief period of time, leave and file their story from Saigon or from Belgrade or from Kabul or wherever it might be. And when they filed that report about position and where a unit might be going, they're long gone. They don't really have a personal safety question. So in that sense, it was really brilliant on the part of Tory Clark and others to put people in a unit they could not escape from, because that created a censorship without ever having to tell us it's censorship or call it censorship, which was one type of censorship. There were ground rules too, which were, you can't report the name and identity of dead in your unit until next of kin been notified, which is generally what we do anyway. And if we had reported future operations, one of the things that I learned in this war is if we had reported future operations, we would have been wrong anyway 90% of the time. So that one rule actually saved us from a lot of embarrassing misreporting. But I tell you, never once did I write a story and put it on broadcast or anything and get it censored. I mean, nobody ever looked at my stories. Nobody saw any word that I ever sent. So in that sense, there was no World War II type censorship.
Brian?
Yeah, I'll echo that too. I was stunned at the fact that there was not one attempt during the whole war to either ask me what I planned to write about, to see if they could read the story, or there was none of that at all. I was stunned as well. 2 days before the war, General Blount, the Third ID commander, took in all the embedded reporters with the Third ID, showed us the plan for the war 2 days before the invasion began. And I mean, some of the officers there said they thought that this was an unprecedented move. And it was a relationship that I think on their part was built on hope as well as trust. And I think the reporters knew that if they did run afoul of the few rules, that they would not be there long. But there was no attempt to spin as well. And I got the feeling that they respected the job the way that we did, and I think they saw us as a link to home as well, which helped them in some ways. But
how tough is it to sort of detect the line that separates reporting or journalism from cheerleading when you're in an embedded role? There have been some critics who think that some people, Judith Miller is a name that comes up from time to time, kind of crossed the line. But in the field, did you ever think there was a tension between your role as a journalist and the fact that you were with this unit? And
yeah, well, I'll just jump in quickly here. I mean, I felt that every day, and I had to make an attempt to maintain an arm's length distance between these guys. But there were guys here who protected me when we came under direct fire, and were concerned about me as well. But I've been in the business long enough that that I think I can compartmentalize. But it was a big concern. But I think the one thing that helped us as well is the war went so well for the U.S. There was not a chance for us to test that, to see what the reaction would have been if things went badly. What would their reaction have been if we started to write store always were
And
critical.
Well, I was just going to say briefly, I mean, this is not the first time, reporters have gotten very close to the people that they cover. I mean, war does have its special case. But I mean, look at Washington reporting. I mean, I covered the Justice Department for a number of years, and you get to know every single person, and every story that you do affects them and reflects on them, and there's a co-opting kind of effect as well in all beat reporting generally. So this is not a first case of first glance here. I mean, this is not brand new, except for like what Brian said. I mean, there are times where you feel like these guys are protecting you, and just like you don't want to say anything bad about your babysitter, because they got your kids hostage, you don't want to say anything bad sometimes about these guys because they've got the weapons that are protecting you. And I guess that would be the difference between general beat reporting, where you are very close to your people you're covering.
I think a good example was one thing that worked about embedding for the people that were trying to cover Central Command was that occasionally it was the embedded reporters who would bring up problems that were going on, and then finally we had something that we could concretely take to the generals and ask them questions about, and it was sometimes hard to get answers, but at least you had something to start with. And a great example was Bill Brannigan from the Washington Post, who witnessed a really terrible incident right after some U.S. soldiers at a checkpoint had been killed in a suicide car bomb. Another car came, I don't know if it was the same unit or
Very nearby and very...
And a car came speeding towards the checkpoint. There was a language barrier. They didn't know to stop, and soldiers ended up blowing away a family of 10. Bill Brannigan had an extremely detailed account of this with what he heard from the radio transmissions of the soldier giving the order to shoot and then saying, "Oh my God, we screwed up," or something like that. And it was just incredibly heartrending and horrifying, because you immediately started to envision how, if incidents like that continued to happen, which they have, it would be a problem for the relationship between it would certainly not help with the effort to win over Iraqi hearts and minds. So Bill Brannigan, who I later met in Baghdad, said that there were no repercussions on him for reporting that was something that had been a source of huge consternation to his unit, and but they understood that he had to report it. And it was the fact that he was there and could report that probably outweighed any risk that he wrote too positive a line in some other story about the people he was with. So I don't know if, I think, and as far as working with the military when you were not embedded, you actually, it's too bad there wasn't more of that during the hot part of the war, but what we're dealing with now is more like the situation I was in when I went into Iraq, which was that you just go up to people that are working in a certain part of the city or in a village, and you try to talk to them. You can also have mini embedded periods where you go for a couple days and work with them. But in the cases where you're just going up to people on the street, you often have an extremely open exchange. In other cases, as the war has gotten tougher, there's been really tense incidents between journalists and soldiers, where the journalists have even been afraid that they were going to be fired on. So it's a lot of variation.
General Ostrom, if the concern on the part of the journalist is kind of tilting too far toward the military, I suppose the military's concern is that it might endanger the troops. Do you think that the embedded reporting in this case had any intelligence value for either the American side or the Iraqis?
Well, I think there's no doubt that there was intelligence value for us. There's a number of vignettes that come out of cases where an embedded journalist may have a better view of what is going on than what the individual unit commander may have. I know the Marines have related to me that even going into Baghdad, a CNN reporter in Baghdad was able to show where friendlies were at and how the crowd was reacting when they were deciding what was the best route to take into Baghdad. This was a valuable piece of intelligence information for us. And I'm sure there are a number of stories of reporters who were able to put some pieces together because their connectivity within their own channels was sometimes being able to put the pieces together a lot better than an individual commander could.
Now, is it your sense that the military would be eager to do this again? And would they change the rules at all, do you think?
The answer is that every war will be different and that every plan will be different. And my suspicion would be is that if we were to plan something tomorrow that looked anything like this, that there would be a plan to embed reporters. But if somebody said, well, what about if Korea became the case? Would we embed reporters in Korea? That's a whole new ball game, if you would. And I think the level of security of embedded reporters in a Korean environment would have some people stand back and say, no, that's not going to work there. So I think we're going to have to take it a war at a time, even though I believe the military would stand up and say, this was a pretty darn good success this time.
I think the military took a really calculated non-risk in some ways during this war. They knew this would be fast. They knew that the intelligence value to the other side would be very minimal because of the speed of the war. And I found it very interesting that when we went through this pause, it was called this operational pause, the rest of the world looked at it as being bogged down for about 5 to 7 days in the midst of the invasion. They started to make some changes to our access and our freedom of reporting, and I thought this was very interesting. They started to take away some of our phones. The Thuraya phones, for example, that we had used very successfully during the whole war to report live on the spot no matter where we were. Suddenly these phones, they discovered, were able to be triangulated. Their position was able to be discovered by the Iraqis, which somehow they didn't know before. I never quite got to the bottom of this. Maybe Todd knows more about it. But it seemed very clear to me that now they were staying in one place. And as long as they're bogged down and staying in one place, they're much more concerned about what our reports would do to giving the enemy some information about where we were. So clearly, as we were moving at very fast speed, reporting live and telling the full story was not an issue for them.
Todd, if you could do the same thing on the journalism side, kind of step back and let's say that we have a similar type situation. Thinking about policy and would you change things somewhat in terms of the rules and the commitment on the part of news organizations to embedding? I mean, what kind of adjustments do you make on the press side given this experience?
I think there's no doubt that news organizations would want to have embedded reporters again. I'm glad Ann mentioned Bill Brannigan of the Washington Post because he's one of the people who witnessed a horrific thing and he reported it there as an eyewitness to history. It wasn't a malicious thing on the American military's part, it just happened. It was a tragedy. And the more that people understand that war is not simple and neat and sweet and precision bombing, that's better. Big organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Boston Globe, they were able to have, and all the networks, were able to have reporters who not only were embedded reporters, but reporters in Qatar, reporters in Kuwait, reporters back in Washington working the halls of the Pentagon to put this kind of story in perspective. And one of the anomalies of the embedding process was how much it caused a temporary emphasis on whoever had the great story of the day among the embeds. And sometimes it caused a corresponding lack of emphasis on a really militarily important development because, let's say, a television embed wasn't there. And a case that comes to mind, which was also covered by Bill Brannigan of the Washington Post, is on the second Thunder run into Baghdad on Monday, April 7th, when the 2nd Brigade of the 3rd Infantry went in to stay. There were 3 highway overpasses, which the Army had nicknamed for the Three Stooges, Moe, Larry, and Curly. And holding those intersections secure was absolutely vital to protecting the supply lines of the forward troops in Baghdad at the palace. And the unit that was doing that for the 3rd Infantry had been the unit that David Bloom was embedded with, and he had died the day before. And Americans did not see on their television nearly enough about what they should have seen that day because it could have gone either way that day. And it happened to go for the American side. But that's something that even, say, the New York Times did not nearly give the adequate coverage to at the time, because we didn't have a reporter with that unit, and we didn't know about it, and only weeks later was,
Alex, taking off a little bit on what you said earlier, the polls show that Americans had a lot of misperceptions about the situation in Iraq. That Saddam Hussein had close links with Al-Qaeda, that Iraqis were rather directly involved in 9/11. During the war itself and in the build-up, most Americans thought the world was about evenly divided or on our side about going into Iraq. How much of that, those kind of gross misperceptions of what was out there in the world, would you attribute to the media generally and maybe the practice of embedding particularly?
That's a good question. And the larger question, I think we might be able to figure out some answers to. I mean, we do know that American public opinion was, in a sense, not only were there misperceptions, but that American public opinion was off the charts compared to other countries, including compared to Britain, which was also engaged in the war. So there is a question about, why did so many Americans believe these things? Going back to the question of embedding, I don't think that the issue was embedding per se. I have nothing against getting more information. I think the issue, and others can probably speak more knowledgeably than I can to this, was the concentration of resources and efforts on the process of embedding and on that, and to the expense and to the detriment of reporting on the larger picture. It was also a way of somewhat inescapably at some point, but of turning this into a focus on a military conflict. War is politics by other means, and the politics of the war were completely lost, I think, as a result. So I think in that sense it played a role, which is not to be critical of the process of embedding, but saying that, even with large news organizations such as the New York Times, or, well, what proportion of your resources are you going to put into embedding as opposed to people trying to find out whether there are weapons of mass destruction, to pick a random example.
We're almost ready to take questions from anyone who would like to ask one out there. We've got 4 microphones set up, 2 here, and with the lights I can't quite see where the ones up there are positioned, but there are 4. And if you'd like to ask anyone on the panel a question, kind of queue up to the microphones. And keep it to, if you could, to a question, not a statement, and as brief as possible. And this is a question for anyone on the panel before we head out to the audience. How do you judge the most recent phase in Iraq? Does President Bush have a point in saying that the real story is not being adequately told?
Well, I can talk about that. We just got back, ABC and Time Magazine, we did a joint project to go to other parts of the country that have not been reported on. And I think what we found was that the bulk of the reporting, for security reasons, for reasons of that's where the equipment is and the security apparatuses, that most of it's coming out of the middle of the country around Baghdad, the so-called Sunni Triangle. What we found was that in the south and in the north, certainly where the Kurds are, things are much better. They're much better in the sense that the occupation's been able to be much lighter because there are far fewer attacks on coalition forces, the Italians and the British in the south, or anybody in the north, really. So they do not have to have the heavy hand that they've had in the middle. What we're finding in the middle of the country, though, is in some senses the story's worse than has been reported. Or at least it's as bad as it's being reported. Yeah. And one of the curious things about what happened today or last night with the Italians being attacked in Nasiriyah is that there had been very few attacks on any military in the south until now. And one of the points of that was that they have been able to gather a great deal of intelligence on any type of terrorist activity in the south and the north because most of the population is unwilling to harbor those types of characters, and they're able to gather a great deal of intelligence on where they are. That may now be changing, and if that's the case, if this attack in the south continues, that is going to be quite significant. But I think there's a much broader story to be told about Iraq generally, because there's not just one Iraq, the Sunnis in the middle.
Anyone here have a somewhat different view on the current reporting?
Well, I returned to Baghdad this summer for 2 months, and I agree with Bob. I think that the story there is as bad as it's being reported. But I think that the president has a point in a way that I don't think we report enough of the small successes there, schools, services, that kind of thing, that are being improved day by day. But I think it's a long, long process, and I think overall the reporting is right on, but I don't think you see balance there that maybe should be explored.
Ryan, you have a question?
Yes, hi, my name is Ryan Cunningham, and I'm a student at the Kennedy School. It was sort of my understanding prior to this war, and I think it's a lot of Americans' understanding, that the press has a fundamentally adversarial role, especially in its relations to and coverage of the federal government and the military. And I understand that during combat engagements, there's a strong national sentiment against presenting primarily dissenting opinions, and especially because we have to support the troops and sentiments like that. However, especially given recent events like September 11th, it seems, at least according to certain quantitative studies, that the presentation of these issues in the press has become less and less and less and less critical. And I guess my question is, do you not think that the Pentagon essentially acknowledged this trend away from criticism and away from the adversarial position of the press in offering to the American media, which had demonstrated, arguably, a willingness to sort of make sure that most Americans get their news from the military than from any other source, to parody the ABC slogan, and offered embedding as an opportunity to capitalize on the willingness of reporters to rely on human interest stories about the troops, graphics and descriptions of the destructive capacity of a variety of ordnance, and a willingness to constrain presentations of dissenting opinions in favor of, you'll forgive me, retired generals?
Well, I just want to say, I think that's a reasonable question up to a point, and I think Tom sort of glanced at this earlier by asking about the whole, obviously the military knew what it was going to get by embedding reporters, and it knew it would get a certain core of sympathy. But a larger question that Professor Kesar was raising is, why are we now asking so many hard questions in Iraq that for one reason or another didn't seem to get asked with quite the same vocal intensity before the war? And there are all kinds of complicated reasons for that, including that, on the case of weapons of mass destruction, for example, on chemical and biological weapons, the whole world community, from France and Germany to United Nations inspectors in 2 separate incarnations, everybody assumed that Saddam Hussein had unaccounted for chemical and biological material that he could either so quickly turn into weapons that it was already weapons, or that he had weapons. And that's just one of those great mysteries of the war, which was clearly, in hindsight, not explored enough before the war, and it's clearly not being explored enough now. Maybe David Kaye's report will eventually shed some meaningful light on this, but that's a real question. And I do think it's fair to ask, in the post-September 11th climate, whether some of the hardest sorts of questions that are clearly being asked now every day, they're being asked in the context of the presidential campaign, they're being asked by the media. It's all well and good to ask those questions now, but maybe we should have asked some of those questions a little harder before.
And I tend to agree, but I think it goes back to, as Todd said, to September 11th. I think we cannot underestimate the transforming effect that had on so many things in this country. And we saw this in Afghanistan when we were there as well. If you remember, there was almost a moratorium after September 11th on doing reporting and asking the question, why do they hate us? I mean, this was one of these things just nobody wanted to talk about. And I'd heard stories that editors were saying, look, let's not do that story yet. We're not ready for it. That there was a transformation into a more pro-U.S. military kind of stand in a lot of the reporting. And we saw it in Afghanistan, where the special forces could do no wrong. And I think we saw it in Iraq to a large degree. But I think that this embedding thing, because there were so many people, it had a multiplying effect on the impact of that.
Does that bother you?
Yeah, it bothers me a lot. I think there's been resources that have been taken away from some other, certainly in the Iraq War, there were resources that were taken away from doing stories in a greater regional context and put them into the U.S. military.
Yeah, please, up in the second level, please.
Good evening. My name is Krishna Guha, and I'm a political correspondent for the Financial Times. I covered the run-up to the war in London, and I'm currently at the Kennedy School on the mid-career program here. I felt, listening to you all, that actually a lot of the shortcomings of embedded reporting actually lay in the side of the editors back on the news desks, and the way in which they prioritize the material coming through rather than actually the reporting in the front line itself. But my great concern about this has always been that by offering the security of embedding, the military was in effect allowed to wash its hands of its responsibility towards the safety of those journalists who chose not to embed. And that, as we all know, resulted in a couple of things. One was that very many left Baghdad too soon, perhaps. And the other was, as we all know, very high casualty rates among those journalists who remained behind. And I wondered if General Alston or any of the other members of the panel would care to comment on this second point, whether or not a responsibility remains on the part of the military for the safety of those journalists who choose to act independently.
I don't believe the military has much responsibility for reporters who decide to act unilaterally. You would never have a system whereby you could control their entry into and out of combat areas. You'd never have a way that I think that the military could have a way to identify where they are at, what they are doing. I don't believe that it ought to be a responsibility of the military. I think this embedded reporter scheme was one that was very valuable to do just that and provided a source to get reporters into the middle of combat, and it worked very well.
Please.
Right, thank you very much. My name is Reverend John Cohn, and I'd like to address why the press and media has not been the educators around the fact that we're dealing with theocracies. We're dealing with monarchies. We're not dealing with a governance that really has a reverence, if you will, for even the people themselves. I mean, I think that the press needs to start helping the public, the United States as well as the rest of the world, understand that these cultures, the roots of them, are really born out of an entire different way of life. And what it is born is all of your terrorism. What are the roots? I mean, the inability to examine the root cause of the willingness on these theocracies or the people that are under a religious influence. And until we get to the root causes of all of the terrorism and so forth, the oppression. And Bill Moyers, a couple of weeks ago, interviewed the president of Union Theological Seminary, Dr. Huff, Joseph Huff, and he's calling for all faiths to unite as one, as it used to be, and address the condition of poverty and oppression that gives birth to the terrorism and violence. The press needs to be active in that arena, is my feeling. Get embedded in the cultures.
Anyone want to comment on that?
Well, I think, I think that there are reasons why there wasn't more reporting out of Iraq before the war. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking, but obviously we need more of that. Obviously we need people who are telling the stories of the countries that we're dealing with, but that's a long-term project. You can't parachute into that country the week before a war and get that story right. So I do think that there was a terribly short-sighted cutback on foreign coverage throughout the 1990s by the press, and we just need to make sure that that gets ramped back up and doesn't ramp back down. I saw my main job as a non-embedded reporter as being to report on what the Iraqi people thought, why they thought that, what they were experiencing as a result of U.S. policies or as a result of the policies of the previous government. But I didn't get there till after Baghdad fell. So, you know, not to tout the Globe, but my colleague Elizabeth Newfer, who tragically died in a car accident while covering the aftermath of the war, had gone to Iraq for a couple of months before the war and tried to get at some of these issues. Were the Shiites really going to rise up and support the U.S., as the administration said? And she quite prophetically suggested that that might not happen. You know, it's a huge challenge to break through the language barriers and do good reporting on cultural, religious, political issues in closed cultures.
Please.
Hi, my name's Sam Hornblower, and I have a question for General Olstrom concerning access in general for reporters. There was an article yesterday in the New York Observer on sort of criticizing the way the CPA PR arm has been managing access for reporters. And I guess insofar as reporters can shape public opinion, under what circumstances are these PR communications officers justified in blackballing reporters from gaining access to key officials?
I'm not so sure I'm familiar with the article. And on the surface, I would say that somebody who's in the public affairs arena should not have the right to blackball a reporter. However, there ought to be some guidelines by which allows reporters to come to a neutral area in which questions would be asked, which creates another problem as to who gets to come in. There's certainly not a capacity to include everybody, so there must be a system. It might be best to ask some of these folks whether they agree with that system on who gets to go to press briefings at the Pentagon or the press briefings at the White House. But I certainly don't agree that it ought to be a military person's responsibility to decide who gets to be there or who doesn't. Any comments from the panel on how to handle who comes?
No, only to express agreement. I mean, there are always choices, and at the police beat or City Hall or at the White House, everyone who's an accredited correspondent is usually allowed to come in to the joint press conferences. But if the White House doesn't like your reporting, they may not give you an interview with the president because that's their way of punishing you. And your way of countering that is to write as honestly and fully and completely about the president as you possibly can. And it's a problem, I think. One of the problems that, as I understand it from talking to people who were in Baghdad in the post-war period and have been there since, and some of the people who worked on General Garner's team that I've talked to, the sheer demands of physical security for the American occupying forces, who are after all, their primary thing is to make sure the top generals don't die, and that the top officials of American occupying forces can do their work. But one of the problems is in that kind of security environment, they had initially no cell phones, no working communications. They were prisoners in their headquarters and unable. Margaret Tutwiler, the ambassador to Morocco, who was briefly detailed there, was essentially unable and unwilling to go deal with the press in a normal way because there was no capacity to do it, no means to do it. I think things are a lot better now.
I mean, I'd love to hear from Bob or Brian, who was there more recently than I was, but in a sense, once we were in Iraq, there was no fear of being blackballed, because blackballed from what? I mean, the second time there was an eruption of gunfire in Fallujah early on, there was a senior U.S. official who told my colleague, who had waited for hours to get to meet with her, she said, "What's Fallujah? I'm in a complete news void here. I'll have to look into it." And meanwhile, the rest of us had all been out there talking to people all day, talking to troops on the ground who expressed the fact that they were fighting urban warfare and guerrilla warfare, and there's 400 marchers. You don't know where the shots are coming from, and you shoot at them, and you don't know if you hit the person who shot at you. I mean, they're incredibly candid. It didn't really matter if the press people in the palace wouldn't talk to us. We had the story.
Which points up another thing, too, is it's the prominent place that press conferences have taken now in journalism, I think, is just horrible. It's not a place I have any interest in going to anyway, ever. I'd much rather go out in the field and find the story where it is and stay out of the briefing room at the White House as much as possible. But I think if you're in there and they don't call on you, scream it out. Yeah, do the Sam Donaldson approach, I suppose. It's another possibility.
James.
My name is James. I work on media issues, among other things. I get most of the news and information that I trust from a number of websites, including Common Dreams, Counterpunch, are two of the best ones as far as I'm concerned. And as far as I'm concerned, I get the feeling this is deja vu all over again. Today there was a story posted to Common Dreams about the response among the Italian population to the casualties and the deaths of Italian soldiers. I'm wondering when that's going to start happening here in our country, and I suspect that the reason it isn't happening with more intensity is because of the suppression of the vitally important information about American deaths and casualties in Iraq. I happen to be from Delaware. I know what the Dover Air Force Base is all about. Helen Thomas has written about it. Other people have written about it. I'd be interested to hear comments from any of you about whether you think that there is adequate information being provided to the American people about coffins, body bags, deaths, and casualties.
Maybe I could reframe that a little bit too. I mean, there seems to be a policy of not covering death. That was true during the combat phase of the war. Reporters have very limited access now to what's happening in Delaware. War is a nasty business. I mean, where's the journalist's responsibility to bring out or not bring out that side of the conflict?
I don't want to, like Ann, tout my organization, and since we both work for the same corporate parent, I don't want to tout the New York Times company, but I don't know how many of you might have seen on Veterans Day yesterday our op-ed page, which had 6 or 7 letters from soldiers in Iraq written just before they died. And I found that one of the most powerful, moving accounts, far more moving than simply seeing video footage of a coffin being offloaded at Dover. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be able to know that there are coffins and how many there are, and I think we should, and I think that's a problem, and I gather that it's different from the Pentagon's posture in past conflicts. And I think the answer, as always, as Professor Kaysar suggested, and is more information first and more discerning processing of the information that there is. And I think the public has grown up. The public has grown up somewhat in the wake of 9/11. And one of the things that I think is somewhat disappointing is that sometimes political leaders in Washington of both parties are unwilling to acknowledge that the public is tougher than politicians think it is sometimes, I think, and is able to process this information.
Please.
My name is Caroline Schaefer, and my question is, with all the success that we've heard about with the embedded reporting, and particularly to you and Bob and Brian, Geraldo's action got a lot of press coverage, and I wondered if you felt like he was treated fairly, if that was a blatant break from the rules, so to speak, when I think he was drawing out coordinates in the sand or something to that nature.
Yeah, well, I think it was. I was in that town the day after he did that. I don't know. I mean, there are two ways to look at that. The Iraqis knew exactly where these troops were. There was no intelligence shared there. But I think that he knew the rules. It just struck me as sensationalism. The story that I would have liked to have seen him done from that town was what the town looked like that day. The town was ruined, and for the most part, 95% of these people had their homes bombed, in flames, charred, stunned. And I don't think that he told that story. So.
And I think that gets back to I think what is the biggest failure of this whole embedding process, which is the fact that we were not able and did not report significantly on the deaths of Iraqi civilians. And part of it is the fact that Saddam Hussein didn't let that many in. If he wanted to report on civilian deaths of Iraqis, he should have visaed up more journalists. But the other thing is that we frankly, as embedded reporters, did not see that much death, although we know a lot of it was happening. And we did our best, I did my best to report on the fact that there was huge amounts of firepower getting lobbed in and shot in to Iraqi villages and places. I did stories on our guys not admitting to me on camera they really weren't quite sure if the people they were shooting at over there were civilians or military. Right. You know, but what would happen is we would, for example, we got one of our platoons got ambushed outside Diwania, and in response to that, the Marine company that I was with fired their mortar unit, about 35 mortars into this village. There were about 40 Iraqis that shot on this platoon. They shot back, got out, and then they shot 35 mortar shells in. The artillery unit about 5 miles back shot about 35 artillery shells. The actual LAV unit that we were with shot 3,000 rounds of ammunition from their 25 millimeter guns from their light armored vehicles. 2 F-16s dropped 500-pound bombs, and 4 Cobra helicopters unloaded their entire ordnance on this place. And then we drove, you know, right past it. Now, we reported all of that. I mean, I don't know how many people see those kinds of reports or in the other stories of the day, it gets missed. But that is pretty substantial mini shock and awe on the way up to Baghdad. So this was a gruesome war. But one of the curious aspects of it is we didn't see that many bodies. The only time we really saw bodies, because we never went and checked on what happened. Because we were stuck with our unit and we had to keep going with them, and they didn't check on it. So the only time we really saw bodies of significance was like when Brannigan goes by a civilian checkpoint massacre, or when we go through an infantry unit that may have been ahead of us and we see what they did. And then we show those pictures.
Could I just say one quick thing? There is a parallel to that. I mean, it's not only war reporting that causes this kind of thing. Political reporting is very similar. If you're following around a candidate or you're covering the White House and you go to the event, you're hustled on to the next thing, and it's virtually impossible for you to do the narrow assignment that is your assignment and canvass the crowd afterward and say, what'd you think of Governor Dean after all? Or so that's why, if you, with luck and hope and good editing and smart planning, you have somebody, a colleague who's there doing that behind you. And the same thing is true. I mean, Dexter Filkins, for us in Iraq, was not embedded with the Marines, but he was following very closely behind the Marines, and he would typically the next day be in Diwania or Kut or one of the other places and write about what was going on.
But that's one thing that was really missing from this war, and I think, I can't remember your name, the FT reporter mentioned this, that there was a real paucity of non-embedded reporters like we've seen in everywhere else that we've reported on. I mean, Afghanistan was difficult, certainly at the very beginning, for anybody to get around anywhere, but once Kabul fell, everybody was everywhere. Certainly in Pristina and Kosovo and other places in the Balkans, that's pretty much all there were. And you got a much more rounded view of what the civilian population that was being attacked by the West was going through and was feeling. And to the extent that resources are being put in embedding, and maybe resources taken away from their security, maybe there is a real shift in balance towards the more military element of that. And I think I agree with your question, your premise, that there was a little bit taken away. Because I know when we've reported in the Balkans, for example, when you're out in the hinterlands with the Marine, you could stumble into a Marine unit, for example, or you could certainly stumble into the British Marines, the 1 Paras and so on, and they would kind of take you in. There was really the opposite feeling in this war. If somebody came in from the outside and we were the embedded guys, we were the ones that they took care of. And if anybody else tried to follow on, they didn't want to have anything to do with them. Now, if they were in trouble, there's a lot of cases where they did bring them under their wing and kept them safe. And I think a lot has been written about that. But others were pushed away, especially if they're French.
Tom, could I ask a question if we're having a discussion? In preparing for this event, I tried to find out the number of reporters who were in Iraq who were not embedded, and I could not find the number. The number of embedded reporters is around. Do any of you have any idea how many American reporters?
During the war or before? I mean, I think it's
either
less than a dozen. I mean,
well,
during
I think
the middle of the war. I mean,
I think it would be more than that. I think less than a dozen in Baghdad, probably 20-something in Baghdad. I mean, or you mean on the battlefield? Probably less than a dozen on the battlefield, not embedded that way. I mean,
I mean, it's just,
in the dozens,
it
in
raises
the
a really
dozens
interesting
compared
question
to in the
because
hundreds.
I'm not defending it. Of course, we needed to be there. And I used to read Anthony Shadid is an Arabic-speaking reporter who works for the Washington Post, and he spent the entire war in Baghdad. And every day he would write these amazing dispatches that really told you what life was like under the bombardment for the Iraqis and covered civilian casualties extensively. I would read it every day as this refreshing view of balance. And the thing is that why was he the only one there? It's partly because, for instance, our reporter, David Filipoff, was thrown out by the Iraqi government for allegedly using his satellite phone at the wrong time of day. But were there decisions made to keep people out because they thought the fighting was going to be a lot worse, or they thought there were going to be chemical weapons used? In hindsight, I'm not sure why there weren't more people.
But I think if there's going to be a good that comes out of all of this, I mean, and certainly the criticism of embedding is the important part here, is that nobody feels that this is the end product, that this is the way military reporting should be done for the rest of eternity. The criticism of this embedding procedure that was relatively successful in this war, extremely successful, certainly from the military standpoint, the pressure needs to be kept up on it so that the big organizations that can afford to do it, I think, put more people on the other side in future conflicts.
We have only about 3 or 4 minutes, so I'm going to break the order, and I think I've got the right order here in terms of how long people have been standing at the microphone. So if you could jump in.
My name's Emma Daly. I'm a journalist. I can tell you quickly that there were more than 100 reporters in Baghdad during the bombing, and there were dozens who weren't embedded, who were running around the battlefield. Many of them were in Kurdistan waiting for the push through Turkey that never happened. Others were put off by the fact that Terry Lloyd of ITN was killed by either crossfire or friendly fire on the first day near Kuwait. I had 2 very quick follow-up questions.
How about one?
I wondered, what do we know, 7 months on, what do we know about the incident in the Hotel Palestine? Do we have a clear picture of what happened, since it was witnessed at one end by embedded journalists and at the other end by a lot of non-embedded journalists? And 2, do we have a casualty count for Iraq? I mean, the people who died in Iraq?
We don't have a casualty count for. Are you our Emma Daly? Hi, I haven't seen you since Madrid. But we don't have a casualty count for people in Iraq, and we never will probably have a definitive one. The AP's laboriously constructed one. Relief groups have constructed one. The Pentagon has said it has no intention of trying to construct one. That's SOP. It wouldn't be typical for them to try. At the Palestine hotel incident, it's still murky. The Pentagon's official account is that this was all proceeded in the best of, for the best of possible reasons. The details the Pentagon has issued an official report, and I'm now fumbling to find the details, but there was a decision. They knew the Palestine Hotel was the journalist headquarters. They apparently did not know that building was the Palestine Hotel. It was a fog of war sort of situation there.
Sorry, and the Abu Dhabi Hotel and Al Jazeera the same day?
Don't know. I don't know about that.
Sir, why don't you take the last question?
Yes, my name is Ned Tebbets, and I'm a graduate of the mid-career program here at the Kennedy School. My question is a very important political question, somewhat tangential to the issue, which has been very inadequately reported in both the print and the electronic media. And that is this, that before this most recent war began, Iraq had incurred very substantial debts to governments and to military weapons suppliers, in particular people in Russia and France and elsewhere. And I've seen very little comment in these sources I've mentioned as to how these financial obligations are likely to be settled. What rationale is going to be used in approaching this subject?
I think you may have stumped the panel.
Todd, I think that's for you.
I think it's for the historian.
Yeah, the numbers, I think, are over $120 billion.
Yeah. Well, the great thing about the Kennedy School is someone out there knows the answer. Thank you very much. Ann Barnard, Alex Kazar, Brian McQuarrie, General Ostrom, Todd Purdom, Bob Woodruff, thank you very much.